All right, it is Thursday, February 8th, 2024, and you're watching the MMA Eco Live podcast. I'm your host, as usual, Chris Presnell, coming at you live from beautiful and very rainy Portland, Oregon, on this wonderful week where we've got a weekend coming up of a couple Asian MMA events. Not a whole lot on the horizon, but we do have another UFC event with a couple prospects that I'll get into. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel, would really appreciate that. Like the video. And if you have any questions to ask me about Asian MMA in general, or anything that's on your mind, feel free to throw that into the chat. Appreciate you joining the podcast. Let's see. I'll go through on today's podcast. I'm going to go through a couple things. But before I do, of course, we had the Road to UFC finals last weekend. I had a watch party, which is the first one of those that I've ever done before, and really enjoyed it. It was the perfect hour and 15 minute, hour and a half minute time slot where, kind of got to offer my own commentary on there, kind of, I guess, inserting myself to be a third person in the broadcast booth with Laura Senko and John Gooden. And really don't feel like I can always add a lot to their excellent commentary. By now they've called, like 6 rounds of Road to UFC, and they know these athletes really well, at least as well as I do, I feel like. So didn't always know if I could always offer a lot, but at least could offer my own perspective and reactions to things. So really enjoyed that. Also enjoyed having the live chat going as well, where we could talk directly about what was going on. So I don't know if I'll do a lot of those in the future. I think they really work well with shorter events for, whole UFC events that are going for 7 hours. That's a long time to sit and watch. So maybe I could see myself doing that for some main cards, just prelim cards. We'll see. But either way, really enjoyed the finals. I feel like folks that tuned in for the UFC Fight Night card and then dropped off really missed out on some of the best action of the night. All three of those prelims, or all three of those Road to UFC finals, action-packed from start to finish. We had Ray Tsuruya beating Jinyu Shirye, and I feel like I would love to see these two fight again down the line at some point. I felt like Jinyu Shirye, a couple of the things that I pointed out that I thought that he could be successful in, the jab, picking him apart on the feet. I felt like we got to see a little bit of that, but Ray, his aggressive, chaotic style just really prevailed and was able to get the TKO finish with 1 second left in round 1. I would have loved to have seen it gone on a little bit longer. I know Jinyu Shirye's coaches would have loved to have seen that as well, but either way, it is what it is. And usually I have a couple questions in the chat by now, which is why I'm pausing just to make sure everything looks good. Let me make sure there's nothing funky going on. Okay. Well, maybe it's just a quieter day. All good with me. In any regard, Road to UFC, excited for Ray Tsuruya, one more young Japanese prospect that has exceptional grappling and is a very flyweight, moves really quickly, lots of fun scrambles, fun grappling exchanges. Excited for him. Not sure who I would match him up with. I think for Ray, you got to throw him in with like the bottom of the flyweight heap. At only 21 years old, you want to give this guy a lot of fights before he gets into the ranked competition, kind of taking the Tetsuro Taira path. And I know a lot of people wish that Taira could have been moved along a little bit faster, but I disagree. And I think that Taira, giving him 5-6 fights before fighting a ranked competition is exactly what you want for a fighter who is really young. And I think they'll probably take the same path with Tsuruya, although he has proved himself a little bit farther than Taira has before going through Road to UFC. So who knows? Also, in the featherweight final, we had a great fight between Ija and Lee Kai-Win. Back and forth battle, also kind of played out how I thought it would. Lee Kai-Wen really making a colossal mistake, taking the fight to the ground. Not even I wouldn't be surprised if Ja sort of just let the takedown happen. He had that first round armbar against Wu Zhaotiebeka on the first round of the tournament, and he just basically was able to lock in that armbar off his back once again with ease, gets the tap. He definitely deserves to be in the UFC. At lightweight, Rongju getting back into the UFC, beating Shin Haraguchi, and just really like a much matured performance from the 23-year-old. And I think that he has still a lot of room to grow, just in being like really polished and really tight. But again, like if you watched my breakdown video, I worried that Shin Haraguchi would be a little bit too one note with his wrestling, and up against the like consistent heavy offense from Rongju, I felt like in the judges, like heavy offense versus, you know, a guy that can only wrestle, either he was going to get the late stoppage or the judge's decision, and the damage was just too much. Third round TKO finish it was a rear naked choke finish from Rongju. And Shin Haraguchi, you know, this guy, I would love to see him take some time off, really invest deeply in the striking, rounding out his game. There's a lot more tools that he needs to add in there. So I don't feel like he should be any rush to get back into Road to UFC. So for season 3 of Road to UFC, that's going to be starting mid to late May, opening round at the Shanghai PI. Haven't heard any names yet. They're still doing applications and casting, all that stuff. But I would not be surprised to see Shuya Kamikubo back in there. I saw today he posted on Instagram. His wife sent him a video message encouraging him to go back into Road to UFC. He's had a win since his last appearance on Road to UFC. So if he wants to do that, I think he's a shoe-in. Other than that, you'll probably see a couple of the Chinese guys that lost in the semis come back again. Yeah, I'll get into all that later, trying to be your main source of news on Road to UFC. Let's see. Let's get into some stuff for the weekend. I see some comments coming in, so that's good. Was a little bit worried for a second. A couple prospects that I want to put on your radar for this weekend. One tomorrow night, LFA 176, and the other one in Australia at Eternal MMA 82. LFA 176 is going down from Phoenix, Arizona. And in the co-main event, you've got a Vietnamese fighter. Another got Quang Le, also fights with LFA. But Tuan Ho has been a guy that a lot of people have circled as a future prospect. Following, really, I mean, there's not kind of leading, I would say leading the pack in terms of Vietnamese MMA prospects right now. Tuan Ho is undefeated, and he fights Miguel Sanson in the co-main event of LFA 176. Sorry. I will be watching that event, doing live coverage for Tapology, so I'll probably end up doing a write-up on Tuan Ho, but really excited for this young guy. Let's see how young he is. He's 5-0, 23 years old, and I feel like if he makes it to 6-0, probably you're going to see him on Contender Series next. Ordinarily, you could see a guy like that signing with the UFC right away, but since he is really young, I could see them giving him a Contender Series fight. His record, I would say really just this fight and his last fight, fighting fighters that were a little more experienced, but I feel like he probably needs one more test before making the walk to the UFC. Also on Saturday, speaking of future potential Road to UFC entrants, I would love to see Hong Sung Chan back in Road to UFC. I feel like he has a lot more to prove, and he is fighting at Eternal MMA against an Australian guy. Let me pull up my schedule here. I wasn't familiar with this gentleman. Wes Capper, Australian guy. That goes down at Eternal MMA 82 from Perth, Australia, airing on UFC Fight Pass. So if Hong Sung Chan can get another win, I think he's a shoe-in for Road to UFC Season 3. I'll be catching that later as that airs at 1 a.m. my time. Let me just share my screen with you because I want to get into this event this Saturday. Or actually, let me do this. UFC Vegas 80, should say 86. Hold on, let me change that real quick. UFC Vegas 86 goes down this Saturday from the UFC Apex. And we've got two Asian prospects this week. We've got Aoriqileng and we've got Loma Lookboonmee. Aoriqileng fights Daniel Marcos. And I think this could be a really exciting and really interesting fight. Marcos is 15-0. So Aoriqileng really has a big test in front of him. I can't say I'm a huge, I'm not super knowledgeable on Marcos, but Aoriqileng got great jabs, good wrestling, and when, especially at bantamweight, has a lot of power. So excited to see his continued evolution at bantamweight. I think he's got a pretty good chin as well. So I think this could be an exciting fight between Daniel Marcos. Not sure who I would pick in the fight, but if Aoriqileng beats Marcos, I think that shoots him up the ladder quite a bit. And then Loma Lookboonmee is looking for her third win in a row in the UFC. She's going to be fighting Bruna Brazil, a Contender Series alum. And for Loma Lookboonmee, she has had a fairly slow burn, even though she's got an 8-3 record right now. She's been fighting in the UFC for a while, finally putting together a win streak. And I got to think that the UFC really wants to get behind Loma Lookboonmee. And the reason I say that is because Thailand seems like it would be the perfect place for the UFC to drop down and grow a fan base. Thailand, as we've seen with one championship, one has relocated kind of their headquarters to Thailand, at least their fight operations headquarters to Thailand over the last year, holding events every single week. And Thailand is one of those places that already has a built-in fight culture. They've got an arena in the Impact Arena, as well as all the different Muay Thai stadiums. But if the UFC went to Thailand, most likely they would be going to Bangkok's Impact Arena. And I feel like UFC really would love to get more Thai athletes on the roster. We saw last year they had Peter Daniso and Top Noi on Road to UFC. Ultimately, didn't work out for either of those guys, but at least had some decent performances, especially Peter Daniso was able to get a win in the opening round. So could we see Peter Daniso actually in the tournament in season 3? I would love to see it. Maybe some more non-tournament fights for him. Either way, would love to see more ties in Road to UFC. But for Loma Lookboonmee, I feel like the UFC is really kind of spearheading their efforts in Thailand. Let me show you my screen real quick, and I'll show you another reason why I kind of feel that way. It's because UFC has, interestingly enough, opened an Instagram account for UFC Thailand. Only 2.2K followers right now, but you see right there on the main page, you've got Loma Lookboonmee right there, another post with Loma. You scroll down, here's another post with Loma, another one with Loma. Very interesting. The UFC doesn't just go around creating Instagram accounts for every single country that they want to have a market. Usually they're broader regions. They've got one for Asia. They've got one in, I believe, Korea. They've got a Eurasia account. They've got a new UFC India account. So, and they also have an Indonesia account. So you kind of look at these as main places that the UFC, I think, really wants to grow. And they're making, obviously, Loma is their only Thai athlete right now. So, and giving her Bruna Brazil, this creates the opportunity for a 3-fight win streak. And eventually, I feel like Loma is really becoming a very complete MMA fighter. We've seen her be able to finish some fights by submission recently. Of course, her Muay Thai has always been there. Her clinch work, second to none. And yeah, I think at 28 years old, now is the time for Loma to have her breakout year. I think if she beats Bruna Brazil, probably she'll get a ranked opponent next and potentially start to enter really the years of her prime. So that's the fight that I'm really looking at this weekend with a lot of interest. All right. Other than that, not a whole lot going on the Asian MMA front this weekend. Some Asian MMA news that I'll cover real quick. Had some big stuff this weekend. We had Matrix Fight Night 14, which, guys, there is a fight on the main event of this card that I cannot stress to you enough how big this fight is. Mostly a lot of fighters kind of leading up to the main event with a fewer number of fights. I'll definitely be watching Raul Thapa. He's a good prospect, I think. And then co-main event, you've got Muhammad Farhad of Brave CF, who has fought for Brave CF before, fighting rising bantamweight Chungrin Korin. I'm not really sure why they're having an interim title fight. I'm not sure what the story is with Alumi Karim, the Pakistani bantamweight champion. But guys, this main event between Abdulazim Badakshi versus Sanjeet Budwar, I can't stress how big of a fight this is. Badakshi is perhaps the number one prospect in all of the South Asia region. And Sanjeet Budwar, I would say, is like my number one male prospect out of India. Badakshi has a massive, massive, massive fan base. Sanjeet Budwar is trying to make the second defense of his title. So I feel like this is literally the biggest fight between the two biggest fighters that could be made in India right now, or the whole South Asia region. So this is a huge fight. If Badakshi wins, that gives him a belt and potentially could set him up to fight in Road to UFC like he was last year, even potentially just going straight to the UFC. That would put him at 15-3. Of course, his last fight against Park Hae-jin, Korean fellow at MFN last year, just destroyed Park in 18 seconds. So Badakshi is a really big prospect. And by the way, this event, I believe Matrix Fight Night has not announced the date and location or venue for this event, but my friend Raul is the editor for India for Tapology, and he also is the commentator for Matrix Fight Night, and he has set this for March 9th in the Noida Indoor Stadium in Noida, India. So I would probably believe that that's when this is happening, day as UFC 299. So massive event going down a spec card. Don't know if we'll get any kind of broadcast outside of India, but for sure, like, there's going to be a ton of Afghanis wanting to watch this fight. You see, there's also two other Afghani fighters on the card, so they try to group them together. Hopefully, they don't have another issue on their hands. The last time they had a couple Afghani fighters on the card, so that's a big event. Also announced this week was an announcement I've been hoping for a long time. Don't know why this took so long, but we finally have 8-0 flyweight Naim Jargal Tumindum Barrel has signed with the UFC. No opponent or date set just yet, but his management on the road announced his signing. And guys, don't know what took so long. He last fought August last year in Road to UFC, and it has been 6 months until the announcement of his signing. Maybe they're actually ready to give him an opponent. Not really sure, but we do have him in the UFC. Glad we could finally get that together. Was going to be almost upset if they're going to make him fight one more time. Otherwise, the only other announcement is Pancrase announced a handful of fights. And let me share my screen with you on that so you can see the full card. I'm going to be sharing just the calendar page from the MMA Ecosystem website, because I've got everything right here for your convenience. So Pancrase going down on March 31st. A couple fights announced today. There's 3 title fights between Akira Okada against Tetsuya Saika. A women's flyweight title between one of these, like, I think Takayo Hashi is 46 years old. She used to fight in Invicta like 12 years ago. She's fighting Honoko Shigeta, a 3-0 flyweight prospect. And then for the atomweight title, you've got Sarami Takano fighting Sayaka Fujita. Also got Ryo Tajima on the card as well. So 3 title fights going down from most likely Tokyo, Japan. Need to add the city there, but those were just announced today. All right, let's get into some of your questions and see what kind of conversations we get into today. What's up, my man? You want a J of Koala MMA? What's my opinion on Octagon MMA? He says, Jack says that there's always something interesting happening there. It seems to me, and I don't follow European MMA as closely as some, but it seems like European MMA is getting really, really big right now. For the longest time, it was really Cage Warriors was really like, Cage Warriors and KSW were the kind of like 2 European promotions. And now we had it was like fighters from Eastern Europe kind of went to KSW, fighters from or Russian promotions, fighters from Western Europe, especially like UK, were all in Cage Warriors. And now we've got Octagon, we've got Bellator kind of had a circuit going on with like Dublin, Aris FC putting on some pretty good cards with some really good fighters in France. And then you've got PFL has their own Europe series now. So it seems like Europe is like such a like, I don't know if bloated or oversaturated, but it seems like there's now multiple pretty big promotions putting on events. And Octagon especially, like they have been bringing in a lot of really good fighters, a lot of really top level European prospects. I have not personally watched Octagon live, so I can't necessarily say a whole lot on like the product, but it seems like I'm seeing a lot of fighters from Octagon going to Contender Series, some going straight to the UFC. The other thing is the attendance. It seems like KSW and Octagon have been like selling out. Like there are so few MMA promotions around the world that could sell out an 18,000 seat arena. Those promotions would be UFC, obviously. One has maybe had a couple of those, not a whole lot. They don't release their attendance numbers, and they usually don't hold full capacity shows in like 18,000 seat arenas. But Ryzen has had some of those bigger shows. UFC, Ryzen, and really just like KSW and Octagon are the only ones I can think of that could sell out like a full like 18 to 20,000 seat basketball arena or even indoor stadium. So that is really impressive. Clearly shows that the demand is exceeding the supply in those areas. I don't know that that'll last for long because I bet you'll get a lot more of these other shows, not only like UFC. It sounds like one also wants to go to Europe. They've talked about even going to Croatia, which is, I don't know if that's still on the cards, seeing as Roberto Soldic has had a pretty rough run with one championship. But yeah, Octagon, it seems like they are absolutely crushing it. Totally. Speaking of Jack, he said that Wrong Jew should be put on Sean Strickland undercards because the people who are afraid of China will love Wrong because he misses weights and spits at his opponent. Well, he's an entertaining guy. I mean, he didn't miss weight for his last fight, right? It was Lee Kai Win that missed weight. So hopefully Wrong Jew has that under control. I mean, he's made weight for all of his road UFC fights and is just getting better and more professional, hopefully getting things under control. So yeah, I think he's a super entertaining guy. He's never been in a boring fight. Talked about this on the watch along, but Shin Haraguchi's lack of tactics to set up his strategy of takedowns was really appalling. But some of the chat was hyping him up because of his wrestling. Why is wrestling always hyped up like that? I would say because usually if you have at least for the longest time, this may be kind of changing now, but usually if you had a fighter that was a specialist in one martial art, but weak in everything else. Like, it was like wrestling for the longest time was seen as the best base for MMA. And I think the reason that was because wrestling also kind of included in the package deal strength and conditioning, and also just like a general toughness, I think, or a general just like grind. And I think because of that, if someone sees that someone's a really good wrestler, a lot of times it's harder for them to pick against them. Whereas like that is starting to change, where it's I think takedown defense is getting better and better. And someone like Haraguchi was able to cruise through the regional scene just on the laurels of being a high quality wrestler. But now that he's getting into the UFC level, you saw that, like, yeah, you can't just wrestle your way through into the UFC. So I think that's why. I feel like when the proper tactics are applied to wrestling, then it becomes a problem. But good wrestling alone will not cut it at the highest level. Exactly. Do you agree with that sentiment that Rong Ju is the fighter people will love to hate? So far, I don't feel like he's given a whole lot of reason for people to hate him. I mean, he's missed weight a few times in his first UFC run, and he showboats a little bit, but I also think he's a lot of fun. He hasn't like said anything extremely like rude or inflammatory. So I don't know. We'll have to see how things go with him. He said, around said, if you are Japanese, of course you will hate him. There you have it. How does one make a respectable opinion in MMA? I see a lot of MMA takes from small accounts that get discounted because of small followings. Is it the following that makes a respectable opinion? Well, no, because you've seen a lot of people with really big followings with certain MMA YouTube accounts. You may know some people who I'm talking about, that I think have recently been really disrespected by the broader, and I would say more professional media, particularly in regards to like WMMA fights or opinions on UFC 300. So I think that there's a lot of people with big followings that attract a less educated fan base. But I would say what makes a respectable opinion, I think when you're allowed to acknowledge nuance, and you also try to maintain a standard of professionalism, which I would define is when you have a discourse, an online discourse. I think keeping it respectable, again, acknowledging nuance, and being able to respectfully disagree with people gives you a little bit of clout. But I saw an exchange a couple days ago between Sodiq Yusuff, some guy who I don't know who he is, excuse me, and they were talking about disclosed payouts. And this guy was claiming to be an expert on disclosed payouts. And it seemed like he was trying to be respectful, but it was the sources that he was citing weren't necessarily reputable. And it seemed like not only Sodiq Yusuff, but a lot of other folks on MMA Twitter were kind of dunking on this guy. So I think you really have to have like solid sources. And I think when you come off really, really strong and see things in a very black and white kind of way, that tends to draw a lot of criticism, whether or not that criticism is warranted or not. But I would say, yeah, just don't move too fast for your britches and for your platform. Be respectful. Kind of, if you're a smaller account, engage humbly. Try to be as informed as you can. If you're going to talk about something like payouts, make sure that you're citing credible things, is what I would say on that. All right, James, give me your shot here. Here's my question about Loma Lookboonmee. In her fight with Reed, she looked terrible because she got swept with a crossface when she had top half guard. How is that possible when her main training partner at the time last year was Wei Li? I even saw clips of Weili helping Loma in wrestling and grappling in a Bong Tao video. That should be a rougher to deal with Elise Reed, but her grappling was still bad. I think her grappling has come a long ways. It's gotten a lot better. I was live at a couple of her early fights in Invicta FC, and she was definitely a much more one-note fighter. And I think it was like maybe her third fight, she fought Amp the Rocket and got submitted with an armbar. So it's definitely come along. I mean, you have to realize how long it takes to really be a well-rounded fighter when you're a specialist rounding out the other sides of your game. Loma is only 11 fights into her MMA career, didn't have an amateur career. So it's going to take a while. I mean, even 10 years of hustling, you're still going to have holes in your game. I think you have to look at it from the broader picture. And her grappling, I wouldn't say it's not like black belt level like Weili's is, but it's a lot better than it used to be, and it's still getting filled in. So even if you're training with someone for a while, I mean, you know how long it takes to get a BJJ black belt. Even if you're exclusively training at a jiu-jitsu gym, it's going to take you 10 years of just training in the gi day in and day out. So the fact that Loma is still able, and Elise Reed is not a terrible, I feel like Elise Reed is a better grappler than she is striker. So yeah, she's going to have some slip ups here and there, fighting better grapplers than her. But we'll see. It's a continual evolution. Missed the watch party, but I thought Road to UFC was better than that dismal Apex card. Agreed. Why didn't they hype that up there with some really cool fights on there? And why didn't they hype that up? There were some really cool fights on there and had great commentary. The product is incredible. It feels like a well-kept secret. And it seemed like it was getting some good love. It seemed like a lot of people I followed on Twitter were tuning into the Road to UFC fights. And once Tuesday hit, Dana White was talking about Road to UFC on his socials. It was getting a lot more love, but it seemed like, my best guess why they didn't talk about the finals more beforehand was that they were trying to figure out what was going on at the event as far as the bantamweight final. So, I mean, that's a quarter of the whole event, but I wish that they still would have just rolled on and promoted it a lot more. Hopefully now that they've got 2 seasons under their belt, and I know this is wishful thinking. I said this last year, but hopefully now they've got 2 seasons under their belt. John and Laura are really good at commentary for Road to UFC. They've got the pronunciations down. They've got an extensive knowledge of a lot of these fighters. Some of them, I'm guessing, will return for season 3. So, yeah, they've got a great knowledge, great on commentary, and it seems like more and more people are seeing like these fights are usually really exciting. It's like Contender Series, but in a tournament style. A lot of fighters really young, really hungry for that UFC contract. So hopefully it's just like, it's tough to promote a product that for most of your audience, it comes on at 1 a.m. in the morning throughout the season. The finals are different, but yeah, I hope that we'll get more. And maybe the Fight Pass thing is part of it too. You know, it's like on ESPN Plus, you get a little bit more lead up every week to the event, and like on YouTube they'll kind of post like some of the pre-fight packages on YouTube. I'd love to see some more of that on YouTube, and I don't know if there's a possibility it would ever be on ESPN, but probably not. It seems like it's a good home on UFC Fight Pass. Happy Chinese New Year to all you as well. Yeah, it's coming up in 2 days. It's a holiday that's big in China. How hard is it for Weili and Xiaonan to not be able to celebrate with their families? Not a fan of Xiaonan, but I do feel for that situation. Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing they're just going to roll through it with training and probably not most likely not going to take time off, not going to like feast for it. I mean, I see this a lot of times with other like Western fighters with Christmas too, fighting in January. They kind of have to, or fighting in December, foregoing American Thanksgiving, things like that. It's a sacrifice that a lot of athletes have to do. A lot of times what you'll see is like they will just kind of delay their celebration, even though UFC 300 doesn't happen until April 13th. But you know, a lot of them probably have plans to go back later in the year after their big fights. So yeah, and the other thing too is that a lot of them will celebrate with family and friends that are nearby, training partners, things like that. So but yeah, it's definitely a sacrifice. I honestly was surprised to see not that the fight got made, because like they're still at the very beginning of their training camps, but I mean, you don't really see a whole lot of Chinese fighters fighting in March, at least to my knowledge. So and then for like JCK, you've got, I think, only one event in February. That's on February 25th. So kind of still right in the middle of Chinese New Year, but they're kind of taking the month off in a lot of ways. So, yep, quiet month for that kind of situation. What about Road to UFC isn't more expensive for the UFC to fly out the Asian fighters to the Apex? Aren't we all in an era where UFC is trying to save money? I would say they liked that it could be a visa thing. It could, I guess you're asking like, why are they, I'm not sure if you're asking why don't they have all rounds of Road UFC at the Apex, or why do they have the finals in the Apex? I think it is strategic for the UFC to do it like they are, where they have the first couple rounds in Asian time zones, because it's a lot easier for those fighters probably to get visas. It's less travel for them, closer to their native time zone, easier to bring coaches, things like that, and also easiest to air in prime time for their local fan base as well. But for the finals, having them in you first of all understand the finals were supposed to be in Shanghai. For them to reschedule those finals as soon as possible basically meant that they had to be at the Apex, because if they're trying to hold these fights as soon as possible, what are their options? Their options are basically what the UFC schedule is first quarter of 2024, which is Toronto, a ton of Vegas cards, Miami, Anaheim. So I feel like it was really what they could do. And I do like that they have those fights later at night in the Apex, because it gives those fighters an opportunity to fly to the US, fight in the UFC airport. I feel like it's a good experience for them. Sometimes you saw a couple years ago, fighters like Aoriqileng, Liang Na, Shailan, they all flew to Florida to fight at that fight. And it was a really big adjustment for them. And even like the Contender Series fights where Chinese fighters went 1-5 that one year. I think that was 2021 as well. But I think getting them accustomed to flying internationally to the US under the UFC lights in their own cage, I think that is really good for the fighters. What's my opinion on the Project Rock sponsorship that the UFC has, and that none of the fighters get a part of the pay, unlike the Venom Fight Kit where they get compliance pay? Yeah, I mean, it's not great. I mean, a free pair of shoes is nice. That's great. But honestly, I think most fighters could probably afford to buy the shoe of their choice if they wanted to. There's also, you also think like there's also like monster logos on a lot of the UFC Venom outfits. There's a lot of things that they have to do that support the UFC brand and UFC business model that they don't necessarily get compensated for. You saw last week, Charles Radke at the UFC post-fight press conference was kind of like, I don't want to answer any questions unless I'm getting paid, which would be the UFC's responsibility to pay fighters for being at media post-fight press conferences, because they're the ones that are telling them they have to go. So it's not the media's responsibility to pay. It would be the UFC's responsibility, which are they factoring that into just the fighters' gross pay? Who knows how they kind of see that. But yeah, I mean, it is not ideal for sure. I feel like the fighters deserve to be paid for that. Really, they're just, the cost of those shoes is probably like what, $100, $200. So it's not great, but independent contractors, no association or union, no collective bargaining. That is what's expected, right? That's what's expected. But yeah, I don't like it as much as anyone does. So do I see Weili and Joanna meeting together as friends? Oh, I did see it. Yeah. Did you think that was genuine? Because I saw some of Weili's biggest haters comment and say it was fake. No, that was no. That's I think that was totally legit. I think that, you know, they were like making dumplings together, right? Like I think you see that a lot with fighters that have especially multiple fights against each other, a lot of cage time together, is that there's a sense of bonding that they're going to be kind of connected for the rest of their lives. Wasn't it? I even recently saw Chael Sonnen say something like he's become really good friends with Anderson Silva. So that was one of like the most bitter feuds in the UFC ever. One of the best rivalries in the UFC was Chael Sonnen and Anderson Silva. And it seemed like that was a pretty legitimate hatred for each other. But even for that, like, they've made a lot of money together, a lot of entertainment for the fans. So I think you see that a lot. Also notice that Dwayne Johnson is also a TKO board member. Does that make him a person who actively underpays fighters? Well, he wouldn't be the one. The UFC would, or the TKO would be the one paying him to be on the board. I don't know what, if he has a specific role on the board. Obviously, he's more involved historically in the wrestling side, but does have those the shoe brand that he sponsors, gives to UFC athletes. But yeah, I mean, he's a corporate guy. He is. If you heard anything about his performance and the whole experience of the Shazam movie, if you haven't heard about that, listen to that. Like, find some YouTube videos, some articles talking about the whole thing with Dwayne Johnson and the Shazam. He basically had this desire to be the superhero of the main character of a superhero movie, and effectively kind of like had this ripple effect on a lot of the other DC properties, because he like wanted so badly to be this really high paid central figure in the universe, and it just didn't really work out all that well. And apparently he was kind of a pain to work with that. So he's well liked by a lot of people, but I think under the surface, he's a pretty corporate guy. Do I think that there are too high expectations for UFC 300? I look at the matchups beside the Harrison versus Holm fight as all interesting. Yeah, here's the thing with UFC 300. I see a lot of people crapping on the card, but think about this. First of all, what is it that you all were expecting? Not literally you all, but like, what is it that fight fans were expecting from UFC 300? Were they expecting 7 title fights on the card? The UFC is not going to do that, because that means that all the pay-per-views around UFC 300 are going to be terrible pay-per-views. They're not going to have enough stars to fill out other pay-per-views. If you look at the UFC 100 card, if you look at the UFC 200 card, and think about and kind of put UFC 300 next to those cards. Granted, we still don't have a main event, possibly even a co-main event. We still could get Leon versus Bilal, which I know fan reaction to that is a little bit mixed, and we also still don't have a main event for the card. So people are saying UFC 100 is terrible without even seeing the full card yet. Don't reserve your judgment until the absolute full card is coming out. It looks like that is going to be, tickets go on sale for UFC 300 it's still a little bit of time. I saw today that it had been pushed back to February 21st is when tickets go on sale for UFC 300. So that's still a little bit of time. It still might be. I thought for sure we'd get the main event this week, but maybe it'll be next week. Not really sure on that. But go back and look at UFC 100 and UFC 200 and compare our UFC 300 card with that and ask yourself, is this really a bad card? I look at UFC 100 and 300 and 200. Granted, there is cards age in different ways. Let me actually just show you these two cards real quick. This is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I think I'll make my point here. UFC 100, the first of the triple-digit UFC cards, had a lot of good fights on it. But like, look at the prelims for UFC 100. You had Stun Gun on there against TJ Grant, Tom Lawler against CB Dalloway. You had Shannon Gugerty opening the card against Matt Grice. Overall, and then you had Jim Miller against Mac Danzig. John Jones, who was not a big, he was a prelim fighter at this point, fighting Jake O'Brien. You had Mark Coleman against Stephan Bonner, Sexyama against Alan Belcher. And then you only had 2 title fights on the card. GSP versus Thiago Alves, Brock Lesnar versus Frank Mir. You had the epic Dan Henderson versus Michael Bisping KO. But like, that was the first one. So is UFC 300 a better or worse card so far than that? I feel like it's better. I feel like there are prelims. UFC 100 had prelims that felt a little bit prelim-y. And now if we go to UFC 200, which I realize is a little bit unfair because they had the main event fall out. But let's just try to imagine UFC 200 with the main event, original main event of John Jones versus Daniel Cormier in a rematch, which would have been the perfect main event. You also had 2 other title fights. You had Amanda Nunes against Miesha Tate, which ended up being the main event. But at that point, again, Amanda Nunes was not a big star. This is when she took the belt. Miesha Tate was a pretty big name, but this was not like a massive fight. Brock Lesnar versus Mark Hunt, that was kind of the rabbit in the hat for that event, but that was not ultimately a great fight. A fairly dull fight. You had DC fighting Anderson Silva kind of at the last minute, also not a great fight. Aldo against Edgar, a rematch for the interim featherweight championship. That was a good fight. And then the prelims, they stacked pretty good. Even still today, a lot of these fighters are still pretty big names in and of their own right. But I mean, you had like Jim Miller versus Takanori Gomi opening up the card. Joe Lozon versus Diego Sanchez. That was a very short fight. Then you had Sage Northcutt versus Enrique Marin. So some good fights, but like thinking about UFC 300, so far what we have matches up to that. And I would even say potentially even exceeds that. And we still don't have a main or co-main event. So I'm just wondering, like, what are fans expecting here? If I'm guessing the main event is either going to be DDP versus Israel Adesanya. I still think we could get Michael Chandler versus Conor McGregor, even though Dana White did say that fight they're looking at for the fall. I kind of feel like there's some negotiation tactics going on here. Some folks have pointed out that Conor McGregor may be trying to get a new contract. UFC is also kind of factoring all this into their media rights deal. So I think there are some bigger things going on. We haven't really gotten any answers why Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler hasn't already happened already. But I feel like expectations are way too high. I'm just like, what actually did people think UFC was going to be? And if that's what you get, whatever, 6, 7, tons and tons of title fights, all these like people coming back out of retirement. I mean, do you really want to see a 45-year-old George St. Pierre? Do you really want to see, I mean, Khabib, okay, I would tune in for that, but he's been out of shape for a long time. Do you really want to see a 45-year-old Brock Lesnar? Do you really want to see Ronda Rousey coming out of retirement for the last like 7 years? That would be interesting. Sure, but I personally would rather have the card stacked with like current big names in the UFC rather than a lot of people who haven't been training for a couple years who are way out of their prime. It seemed like people thought that we were going to get a lot of those. Like, sure, let's get GSP versus Khabib, but like, guys, Khabib has said so many times that he is not coming back. Like, sometimes you just got to let things go. And I think that if we get DDP versus Adesanya, imagine if we got both DDP versus Adesanya and McGregor versus Chandler, in addition to what we already have, I think that absolutely that would be the best UFC card that we've already gotten. If you just look at this thing as it is right now, I mean, it's an incredible card. And if there's like even a main event that's like pretty good, it feels like a 10. I mean, just put it up next to like what have been some of the biggest UFC cards that we've got in history. We've got UFC, the first New York show, Conor McGregor against Eddie Alvarez. I feel like UFC 300 in terms of star power and quality goes up against that. And then the only other ones that come to mind in terms of like epically big UFC cards are UFC 100 and 200, which we just looked at. And I feel like 300 so far stacks up really well against that. The smallest fights on the card are like Sodiq Yusuff versus Diego Lopez, which are two ranked guys, or at least Yusuff is, and Lopez is one of the most entertaining guys on the roster. The other like lowest fight that we have is Jim Miller versus Bobby Green, which is just feels like so right to have that on UFC 300. Both guys super entertaining. Jim Miller just like making this incredible appearance on UFC 100 and 200. So I know it sounds like I'm shilling for the UFC, but I just feel like realistically, guys, I mean, we're already getting tons of Apex events. I feel like kind of in response to UFC 299, UFC 300 being so stacked. The ripple effect is that we're getting a lot of Apex shows. So do you really want an epically huge UFC 300 and then a string of really weak pay-per-views? I don't. I think UFC 300 is just fine the way it is. Give me good pay-per-view. I mean, we've set ourselves up to have a good main event UFC 301 if we've got Alex Pereira defending the light heavyweight belt. And then also, man, I would love to see Alexandre Pantoja defending his belt against Kyoji Horiguchi, co-main of UFC 301. We just saw Dana White meeting with Nobuyuki Sakakibara at the UFC headquarters earlier this week. Horiguchi has stated he wants to go back to the UFC. Man, how cool would that be if they could send Horiguchi over and potentially have this Japanese UFC champion? Oh, you know, I would love that. UFC 301 could be excellent. And I feel like, yeah, no complaints from me with UFC 300. What were y'all expecting? Okay, rant over. What else you got for me? What do I think? Oh, yeah, I think I just talked about this. Claiming to be an expert on disclosed payout. You got to watch yourself if you're going to argue about fighter pay with a UFC fight. Like arguing with a UFC fighter over what he made, you're never going to win that fight. And to be fair, I don't think Sodiq Yusuff was even defending or attacking UFC fighter pay. He was just like, bro, like that ain't it. I thought that was pretty funny. And yeah, posting fake payouts helps no one, right? Doesn't help anybody. James saying, I'll tag you in that Elise Reed clip where Loma got swept on the crossface from Open Note Grappling. Yeah. I wouldn't say it's unique. I think you see a lot of high level fighters training with other high level fighters like that. What do you think of short 4-fight cards like Road to UFC? Well, yeah, I mean, we get that with Contender Series too, just 5-fight cards with not a lot of filler. And I love that. I don't know. I think I'm torn on the potential of a day where, say the UFC finally listens to a lot of the critics on the oversaturation issue. What if the cards that they had on the road in full arenas, if those were their 13 fight events, but then the Apex shows were maybe like 5 to 6, basically just a main card. And then they trim a little bit of the roster. I wonder if we would get as many people complaining about Apex shows and oversaturation if maybe those Apex shows were a little bit shorter. I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer is on that, but I love those short events. Just short and sweet, doesn't take up your whole day, your whole evening, or your whole morning. I really like it. Are you surprised that Chael Sonnen of UFC Hardliners didn't opt out of the class action lawsuit that is being covered by John Nash and Eric McGrocken? Well, yeah, there was a lot of UFC, I mean, no one opted out of the class action lawsuit. So I wonder what the story is behind that. I doubt we're going to get a lot of fighters commenting on that publicly. I would assume that they'll probably just want to stay out of it. But yeah, nobody opted out. I hesitate in interpreting that as UFC of all the fighters in that class want to like stick it to the UFC. I hesitate it in interpreting it that way because, like you said, there's a lot of UFC loyalists that didn't opt out. So I'm not sure what the story was behind that, but I did find that really interesting, Chael included. Did I see that Sakaki Bara and BKFC promoters met up with Dana White? What's your speculation, and what could the meeting have been about? I'm guessing that for Sakaki Bara, he was talking to Dana about Kyoji Horiguchi and Kai Asakura. Both of those fighters have voiced an interest in going to the UFC, and for Sakaki Bara trying to build his brand, that would obviously really hurt Rizin because that is arguably their two of their biggest MMA fighters. Horiguchi, I would say, is probably the best fighter on the roster at the moment. But Sakaki Bara, he seems like a really humble guy. He does have a previous he's got a long-standing relationship with Dana White, right? Like even back to Pride's heyday, like they had the whole like sending Chuck Liddell from the UFC to Pride to try and win the Grand Prix, all of that. So those guys have a long relationship. I think they have and then of course buying Pride from Sakaki Bara. They have a long, very respectful relationship. And for Sakaki Bara, I could see his loyalty to those fighters and his humility. And I think wanting Japanese MMA to succeed. I think that Sakaki Bara would love to see a Japanese UFC champion because of what that would do for Japanese MMA. Because even though Rizin can really build a lot of their brand around Horiguchi has done so much in Rizin. At the same time, they would be fine without Horiguchi and Asakura. They've got so many incredible fighters, so many good assets to build a brand around. And I think with Horiguchi being 32 years old, now is the time. Let's send him to the UFC. Let's try to get him in a title shot against Alexandre Pantoja. I know the two train together, so that could be an issue. But ATT is a massive gym, and I mean, I feel like they see teammates fighting teammates as often as anyone. So I feel like Sakaki Bara would love to see Japanese fighters successful in the UFC because of the ripple effect that could have on Japanese MMA. So I think that'd be a pretty smart proposition for him. As far as BKFC, that is obviously a really quickly growing sport. And I don't know, on the one hand, I could see that just being like a friendly, like swapping ideas kind of meeting where they're not necessarily talking about any kind of partnership, but just kind of like we're both promoters of a leading martial art, BKFC, or bare knuckle and MMA, and we're just trying to like talk shop basically. I could see it just being a friendly interaction like that. In terms of like a partnership, the crazier things that I could see is like a Fight Pass partnership, or even like, I mean, the wildest imagination would be like UFC buying, or Endeavor, TKO buying something like BKFC and adding bare knuckle boxing, MMA to their profile. Got pro wrestling. They've got, because here's what I see TKO doing. I think TKO in the next couple of years is going to want to become sort of like a martial arts conglomerate. Martial arts and entertainment, to throw wrestling in there. I think they're going to want wrestling, obviously UFC. They're probably going to make some kind of move at some point with boxing. And then I could see and then they've got slap, and then they've got, if they could add bare knuckle, whether that's a partnership or outright buying bare knuckle. But you could totally see that, right? Because then you could see them doing the one championship thing where fighters are able to flow in between different things. I know UFC, they like to keep their fighters healthy so if they can compete in UFC. I don't actually see those kind of crossover things happening all that often. But if the situation really, really warranted it, they could eliminate some of the yellow tape and make some of the bigger fights that people want, whether it's a boxing fight or a bare knuckle fight. I could definitely see that happening. You know that I'm a big Kyoji Horiguchi fan. Oh yeah. Would it be a fantasy main event for 300 to be? Oh man, brother. I would love that fight as much as anyone. I mean, that fight to me, it could be a pay-per-view main event for anything other than UFC 300, but yeah, they're not gonna put a flyweight title fight for a UFC 300 main event. I know. Like, we love the fight, but like, can you imagine all the fan complaints if a flyweight title fight was the main event? It's gonna be, if it happens, it's gonna be on 301. Which, the other thing is, like, I didn't mention this with my UFC 300 rant, but imagine if UFC 300 had any other number to it. If it was 301, 302, 303, just an International Fight Week card, like, it would be spectacular. People would say it's the best card ever, but just because it's 300, people feel like it has to have another added quality to it. But yeah, unfortunately, that's not going to be the main event, but that would be an amazing flyweight. I would maybe feel comfortable putting that as a main event for like a UFC Brazil card, but even there, it would get some complaints, but none from me, none from you. Common thing that gets brought up every week is Weili's game planning. Would you ever make a video on Weili's beautiful crafted game plans and how they change from each fight since second Rose fight? Could be a cool video. Yeah, I'll make note of that. I'm scheduling out the rest of the year for sure. To add or parlay off Rio, I was just in a live chat with Weili, and she mentioned that her team is constantly studying her opponents, and that if you look at her last 4 fights, her strategy's changed. Totally. Couldn't agree more. Good day. I remember you complained about India didn't get any MMA event announcement in 2024. Thank God Matrix Fight Night 14 finally has a thing. Thanks for reporting and announcing the next India event. Yes, and there is, I will mention, I didn't mention it earlier, but I will say that there is also an event this weekend going down in India, Warriors Dream Series is going down. Let me see where that's happening at. From Mumbai. And there's a handful, there's a pro fighter main card on there. So that is on the Locker Room India YouTube channel. The link for that is on my website on the calendar page. You can check out that full card. So there is also another thing going on in India this weekend. And then, sorry, Makoto, I missed that second part of your comment there. She also mentioned that she considers her own mistakes and thinks about how her opponent will game plan against her. Is that a step that most fighters don't do? it does take a level of humility to be able to get there. A lot of fighters, I think, believe too much in their strengths and abilities, and because of that can be a little bit blind to their weaknesses. Weili does not seem like someone who has that kind of pride and is willing to like really lean into her weaknesses. And you're right, totally strategies have changed the last couple fights. Drake and Alex B or Alex Boonin had an excellent discussion on Sound and Pound on the 185 division, whether it's good or not. Do you know what causes divisions to become bad? Well, that's all a matter of opinion, and it's also relative to a lot of things. I think when you have a lot of, because that's hard to answer because there's a lot of definitions on what makes a division good or bad. Sometimes a division just kind of is what it is. And I think right now middleweight just has a lot of fighters in it that don't have the most entertaining styles. It seems like we're not getting a lot of crazy finishes. There's a couple interesting personalities in like DDP, Adesanya, Pereira, if he comes back down. Like there are a couple really big stars at middleweight, but it seems like there's a lot of fighters that have really like grappling heavy styles at middleweight. And sometimes just the matchups don't produce exciting fights. I would say that's like the most broad general way to describe middleweight's problem right now. But you look at how many like apex main events have been middleweight fights. I mean, we had this weekend we've got Hermanson versus Pfeiffer. Last weekend we had Dolidze versus Imavov. April 6th we've got Vettori versus someone on April 6th. Blanking on that. But yeah, totally. And then Sean Strickland for a while was in the Apex as well, versus Brendan Allen, another grappling heavy guy. So yeah, I think it'll change. I mean, divisions, you have to realize like divisions come and go. Like they have their heydays. I think middleweight has a lot of movement right now, and there's a lot of fresh matchups on the one hand, but most of the most exciting matchups for me are already at the top in the like Pereira, DDP, Adesanya triangle, and then like Strickland you could throw in there as well. But yeah, it's just at a weird spot right now. And I'm gonna have to pop off in just a second. Let me see if I can at least get some quick answers here. Why is Mick Maynard lacking self-awareness? There hasn't been a good card this year yet, and there has been plenty of bad cards the last 4 years. I think there's a little bit of lack of like fan reception. Mick Maynard doesn't seem like someone who's really like plugged in on like social media that much. And for him, I mean, he's cage side at events. He has a different kind of investment in how things go and just has a different perception of fights and events. And I think he just sees things differently. I think he is a little bit out of touch maybe with a lot of common fan perception. What do I think of that culture that smart MMA accounts like Jack Slack, Connor Raybush, Miguel Class, and chat favorite Ghost make fun of bad takes? I mean, personally, and I'm not telling these guys what to do. I mean, they have their own brand, they have their own style. But personally, I feel like as a whole, like sometimes I think there is a line where it's okay to point out like people posting yellow bold payouts. Those are things that should be called out because that actively harms the sport, that harms fighter pay. It's literally just false information. But there are also a lot of fans that are like, I would say, coming along in their MMA knowledge or new fans. And we always complain about social media being a toxic place. And I'm not sure if just like roasting every single bad take is really helping with that and really helping like the overall MMA social media culture. And there's been a couple times where I've said like mean things on social media, and I hold back about 99% of the like just like cynical things that I would love to say towards other people, or I stay out of pretty much all the fights that I would love to get into, just because I think I just take a step back and be like, hey, is this actually making social media better for everyone? Is this making it a better experience for people? Is this the social media that I want to participate in and that I want to enjoy? And I think that there is a lot of like cynicism and roasting people that can I think go a little bit overboard sometimes. Again, doesn't mean that we shouldn't call out like bad takes, like really bad, like I would say like harmful and things that actively go against the development of the sport. But personally, I would love to see a lot of the cynicism and negativity dialed back a little bit. That's just my personal opinion. They also often quote tweet very bad takes, and their followers just torch the bad tweets. Do you consider that a form of bullying? I think you could make that argument, to be honest, especially if you have a really big following. Like, you could, I mean, we all have bad takes, right? Like, all the time, like, I feel like I'm in a position to comment on fights with fighters that I don't know very much about. Like earlier in the show, I talked about Aoriqileng versus Daniel Marcos. I was careful not to like really state an opinion on that, just because I haven't really looked into the fight. I'm not really familiar with Daniel Marcos. But if I were to like have an opinion on that, it probably wouldn't be very educated. And then people would be coming after me because I wouldn't be very educated. So like, I don't know. I don't know if it actively like helps the MMA fan base by putting people's name on a poster and then having everyone roast him in the comments. If you remember, JHK fell for the meme news that 165 and 175 was being made for UFC 300. He had another 15-minute segment again of Dana announcing fights that haven't been signed yet. So my question is, who needs to do better? Guys in the media like JHK who are making content based on meme news, or the UFC announcing fights officially before they are even signed? Yes, on the latter. But there's also not really consequences for that. I don't think you're going to see a dip in ticket sales. I don't think you're going to see the media not posting things. I think you're still going to see most fans believing it, especially if Dana White says it. So I don't think that really is going to have a lot of negative consequences. I listened to the segment with JHK talking about the 165 or 175 pound division. And if I'm just like believing the best, if I'm choosing to believe the best about why he chose to talk about that, is that it was mostly just a conversation piece rather than like fully believing. That's how I kind of interpreted it. But it seemed like he was kind of like, oh yeah, I heard a rumor that they could be fighting for a 165 pound title. What do you guys think about that? And then it was just kind of like a conversation piece, which I think is a great conversation piece. Like, you get a couple people who really like MMA in a circle and talk about, should the UFC make a 165 pound weight class? Could Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler fight for that belt? I think that's a really interesting conversation, whether or not it's actually going to happen. So I feel like it's not common or character. And the other thing is you have to understand a little bit about who JHK is. He is a professional. He knows how to like break news appropriately or not break news, which he really doesn't break a whole lot of news nowadays. But the other thing is like he really likes the wacky side of MMA. He's really into like the whole fight circus thing. He loves the drama, and that's just his personal enjoyment of MMA is sometimes the wacky. So I feel like he just enjoys some of those kind of more off the wall conversations like that. And I appreciate that because it's entertaining. It's fun to have those conversations, whether or not they happen. So that's kind of how I read the situation. If you read it differently, that's up to you. That's kind of how I read it. Let me just touch these real quick. When a fighter is overmatched in fighting someone, when is a fighter overmatched in fighting someone really good? How does that affect the coaching of the worst fighter? Do they have to be real to the fighter, or should they just blow smoke to the fighter so the fighter does not lose confidence? I think it is a big confidence thing. Think about the Anshul Jubli versus Mike Breeden fight. Rounds 1 and 2, easy Anshul Jubli rounds, and by all accounts, Jubli should have won the 3rd round as well. But then his coaches just unloaded, just dumped the. I'm thinking of the meme of the guy dumping the giant bottle of oil. They just like dumped confidence on their fighter, and that's what he needed. So I think confidence, and then just like because they know like if he's George St. Pierre, you're not going to be able to stop the takedown, you know. So I think confidence might be your best weapon, because that is actually something that you can hold over your opponent. But then you just have to hope for the upset, I think. Do I know why PFL has kept Bellator's branding? Most likely because of media rights deals, I would say. If you yourself bought a fight promotion, would you remove all aspects of the bought promotion, like UFC, what UFC did to Strikeforce, WC, and Pride? I mean, yeah, you have to ask, like, why didn't UFC immediately, like, it's the exact same story with all these promotions. We're buying this promotion. We're going to keep the organization going, give it a fresh coat of paint, and then a year later, they end up dissolving things. I feel like that's because of media rights deals. It allows them to transition, have a transition period as well. Get to know fighters, get to know coaches, managers, and like have a smoother transition process. But I think it's mostly because of media rights deals, is my guess. We'll see. Very interesting. We'll see how this event goes in 2 weeks, right? Crazy that is already coming up, but they've got the Champ versus Champ show February 24th in Saudi Arabia. But that does it for me, guys. Really appreciate you guys tuning into the stream. That was a fun one today. Maybe might post a couple clips from today's show on the YouTube channel. My next video coming out early next week is a preview of Zhang Mingyang's fight against Brinson Hibiero. Mostly kind of an introduction to Zhang Mingyang, who he is, what his skills are, what can we expect, all that good stuff. But filmed that today, should have it out hopefully by Monday. In the meantime, enjoy the fights this weekend. Enjoy UFC Vegas 86. Enjoy One Friday fights and LFA, CFFC. Oh, I forgot to mention, I just saw CFFC has an Indonesian fighter named Bilal Hassan, 2-0 guy with 1 no contest. Fights out of Everett, Washington in the UFC, or in the USA. Yeah, going to be excited to watch that show, CFFC. Also, you got Fatima Klein. Check her out in the main event. Otherwise,